Synopsis: Edward Windsor was a prince, born of the queen consort. His mother, a mere palace maid, died during his difficult birth. Growing up amidst disdain and mockery, he learned that books were useless, only a strong, resilient body could truly protect him. Amelia Mason, the Grand Preceptor's daughter, believed that reading held the key to the world, far more intriguing than anything else life offered. She was versed in ancient alchemy and scriptures, and he was startled by the brilliance in her eyes. How could such a remarkable woman exist? Inexplicably, Edward Windsor, often overlooked, was appointed crown prince by the late king. Upon ascending the throne, he found ruling arduous and strategies often ineffective. The vast royal palace was rife with pitfalls, and court life left him bewildered, fearing ridicule. He needed someone trustworthy, someone exceptionally capable, to assist him. This person could only be his empress. She would be his wife, he her husband. As the ancients said, a harmonious couple works in unison. Scholars have always dreamt of chivalry. Amelia Mason, though no scholar, yearned to be a true knight, thus agreeing to enter the palace for Edward Windsor. After weathering hardships, wars, and misunderstandings, solidifying their lifelong bond, a greater calamity befell them. Could they ever rediscover happiness? Chapter 1, A beautiful, gentle, and pure soul. On a rainy summer night, the sound of rain and thunder shattered the quiet. Amelia Mason drew back the bed curtains and sat up, her maid, Grace Mason, quickly draping a robe over her shoulders. "What hour is it?" she asked, leaning against the bedpost. "Your Majesty, it's just past the third watch." "Did the thunder wake you?" Grace Mason, who had accompanied Amelia Mason from the Mason estate, knew her mistress well. "Yes. Ever since childhood, storms disrupted her sleep. The thunder had ceased, but the rain persisted." She frowned slightly. "Grace Mason, bring the lamp closer, light some incense, and fetch the poetry book from the table." "Queen." Grace Mason's tone held disapproval, but she complied. Once engrossed in a book, her mistress would lose all track of time, reading voraciously, as if possessed. "What's that light over there?" In the dark, rainy night, even a flicker of candlelight shone brightly. Grace Mason lit the incense, brought a chilled bowl of lotus seed soup, and, hearing her mistress's question, glanced out the window. "That must be Celestial Hall. His Majesty is conferring with the Prince and Chancellor Adrian Blake. Riverlands has flooded badly this year, many areas are submerged." Amelia Mason nodded, her voice laced with worry. "General Andrew Hart went to Riverlands last month for disaster relief. I wonder how things are progressing. Eunuch Lawrence Park just delivered several memorials, the General's memorial might be among them. Then let's set aside the books for now and review the memorials first. State affairs are more crucial, books can be read anytime." Grace Mason, with words caught in her throat, sighed and turned to fetch the memorials. The current His Majesty Edward Windsor, young, talented, and resolute, possessed both wisdom and courage. Since his ascension, the nation prospered, and the borders remained peaceful. However, this emperor had one bad habit, an aversion to reading memorials. Whenever he sat before the regal desk, the sight of memorials dense with script would instantly make him dizzy. But he had a queen who was an avid reader, possessing a remarkable memory. No matter how numerous the memorials, the queen could recount them fluently and clearly after a single glance. Every night, a peculiar scene unfolded in the king's study, the queen read the memorials, and His Majesty gave his approval, a rare sight within the royal palace. The kingdom's current territory was hard won by the late emperor. The common folk often compared the current emperor with his predecessor, discussing who was wiser and more virtuous, who levied fairer taxes, and whose reign was more peaceful. In truth, they didn't choose their emperor, and their comparisons couldn't change anything, so it served merely as idle chatter. His Majesty's aversion to reading memorials surprised many, but it didn't seem to cause any issues. The memorials that arrived today would surely be reviewed by morning, so what could the officials say? The officials had subtly criticized the queen's reading of the memorials. The principle of the inner court not interfering in politics was fundamental to every nation. However, the current queen was gentle and kind, only reading the memorials without ever uttering a word about state affairs, rendering their objections unspoken. Grace Mason knew her mistress disliked explanations or embellishments. Despite her high standing in His Majesty's favor, surpassing Clara Thompson and Sophia Bennet by far, she only cared for books. A book in hand was all she needed, she had no desire for worldly competition. The palace staff whispered that the queen had read herself silly. When Amelia Mason was crowned queen, many were astonished. Considering her background, she was merely the daughter of an impoverished Grand Tutor, far less prominent than Clara Thompson, the favored daughter of the founding general, or Sophia Bennet, the daughter of the esteemed eldest princess. As for her appearance, she was considered comely, but compared to the other two consorts, her youth made her seem naive. Furthermore, her aloof nature prevented her from befriending influential eunuchs and palace maids. From her entry into the palace to her ascension as queen, only His Majesty steadfastly supported her, she had no other allies. Yet, she remained firmly seated upon the throne. Like others, Amelia Mason knew this was unconventional. Her extensive reading of history made her acutely aware of the palace's treacherous nature, where a single misstep could lead to ruin. If she couldn't defy the imperial decree, she should have clearly refused and distanced herself. But, born the daughter of the Grand Tutor, what choice did she have but to obey? His Majesty was no stranger to her. As a child, he frequently visited Mason Estate. Before their wedding, he even snuck out of the royal palace to see her, confessing his admiration and trust. He confided in her about his loneliness within the vast palace and asked for her help, mentioning a grand library containing any book imaginable. She gazed at him with clear eyes for a long moment before solemnly nodding. In the autumn of her 14th year, she married him, becoming his empress. On their wedding night, they spent the entire night reviewing memorials in the main hall, and she truly understood his need for her assistance. Her days were full, spent reading during the day and reviewing memorials in the evening. Palace affairs were managed by the court ladies, and in the evenings, His Majesty would either be with Clara Thompson or Sophia Bennet, so no one accused her of vying for favor. Unbeknownst to others, while she was the empress, she wasn't truly His Majesty's wife. On their wedding night, he had said, "Amelia, you are still young. I will wait for you for a few years." 2 years had passed since that promise. She didn't mind, in truth, she secretly hoped he'd forgotten. She preferred the quiet company of books, finding the stories within far more captivating than the affairs of the world. "Your Majesty, is there a memorial from General Andrew Hart?" Grace Mason inquired, noticing the Empress flipping through several memorials, then setting them aside, lost in thought. "Yes, the refugees have been settled, but there's been a delay in delivering the disaster relief funds." "Isn't that good news?" Grace Mason was puzzled. The refugee situation was resolved, so why did the Empress seem worried? The relief funds had been dispatched long ago. The delay meant someone was embezzling. Who would be audacious enough to steal from disaster relief? Amelia Mason racked her brain, but couldn't identify a suspect. "Is the Empress still asleep?" A voice, deliberately lowered, came from the palace doorway. Recognizing His Majesty's voice, she knew his late-night arrival, braving the rain and wind, signaled urgency. She quickly rose to change. The night-duty court lady, startled by His Majesty's late arrival, stammered nervously, "Your Majesty has been awake since the 3rd watch, reviewing memorials." "Very well, no need to announce me. I'll enter myself." Half-dressed, Amelia Mason heard his footsteps approaching. "Grace Mason, bring His Majesty a bowl of soup first." "I'll be right there," she called out. His Majesty's previous visits were always announced from afar, giving her time to prepare and greet him at the door. Tonight's unexpected arrival left her flustered. She didn't want him to see her disheveled, it was improper, especially given their lack of intimacy. Seeing the Empress struggling to tie her robes, Grace Mason shook her head and went to receive His Majesty. Finally, after a frantic struggle, Amelia Mason managed to don her Empress attire and emerged from her chambers with the memorial. Under the candlelight, His Majesty's face was etched with worry, his brow furrowed in a deep frown. Even eunuch Lawrence Park, attending him, dared not breathe too loudly. Seeing the Empress emerge, he bowed, silently sighing in relief. Though young, the Empress was a calming presence for His Majesty. Amelia Mason smiled faintly at this, nodded, and approached His Majesty to curtsy. "No need, my queen. It's late, and I've already disturbed your sleep. I feel terrible about that." His Majesty waved his hand, gesturing for her to sit beside him. "My queen, why are you sweating so much? Are you all right?" Seeing her face covered in perspiration, His Majesty asked in alarm. The Queen's chambers were the coolest area in the harem, surrounded by lush greenery, and he had even specifically ordered a waterside pavilion to be built there. When summer arrived, neither the main hall, the Celestial Hall, nor any other palace could compare to the coolness found here. On late nights reviewing memorials, he often brought the Queen back, and upon entering the Queen's chambers, the distinct coolness compared to the outside would calm his heart, bringing an unusual sense of peace. He longed to stay, but whenever he met the Queen's uncomprehending gaze, he couldn't bring himself to speak, hastily bidding farewell and slipping away. Yet, he couldn't resist turning back, but by then, her figure was long gone. He chuckled wryly, unsure whether to resent the Queen for not being alluring or to feel fortunate that she was too pure. He had indeed said those words about waiting until she was older to consummate their marriage, but given the current situation, he didn't know how to proceed. It seemed his Queen was quite content with her current life, how could he disrupt it? He had invested all his heart and soul into marrying her. "Oh, it's nothing, Your Majesty. The weather is just too hot, and I've perspired a bit. I apologize for making Your Majesty laugh." Amelia Mason wiped her forehead with a handkerchief and moved her chair slightly away so the smell of sweat wouldn't reach His Majesty. In this heat, wearing the Queen's attire, which was thicker than a quilt, how could one not sweat? She felt like she was suffocating from the heat. "From now on, you can just wear ordinary clothes in the palace." His Majesty couldn't bear to see her drenched in sweat, offering her a glass of chilled pear juice. "Have a sip, you'll feel better." "Thank you, Your Majesty. I just had a drink." "Please, Your Majesty, have some." She replied formally, her head bowed, letting the sweat soak her clothes. His Majesty didn't press the matter, glancing at the eunuchs and palace maids in attendance, and said authoritatively, "You may all leave. I wish to speak with the Queen." Everyone bowed their heads and slowly withdrew. Eunuch Lawrence Park didn't forget to close the door behind them. Amelia Mason placed the memorial she had just reviewed on the table. "Your Majesty, these are the memorials I've finished reading. Do you have any questions?" She understood the purpose of his late-night visit. After 2 years together, this much understanding was natural. Someone embezzled the disaster relief funds, didn't they? His Majesty's tone was laced with suppressed anger. She nodded, quite surprised by his astuteness. General Andrew Hart reported that he had arranged accommodations for the disaster victims, but the living assistance funds haven't reached them yet. He's worried about a potential uprising. That damned beast. How dare he exploit the funds meant to save lives? Has he no regard for me? His Majesty slammed his hand on the table in fury, causing the tea in his cup to slosh over. "I pitied her since she was young, forced to marry a 70-year-old man for the sake of the country, widowed while pregnant. The late emperor felt remorseful towards her and allowed her son to inherit the throne. Since my ascension, I haven't mistreated her, granting her every wish within my power. She didn't want to be an idle royal consort and wanted to involve herself in the Ministry of Revenue, and I agreed. She should have served diligently, but unexpectedly, he dared to touch the disaster relief funds. He's trying to anger me to death. His Majesty was truly furious, kicking the table in a fit of rage, sending cups and dishes crashing everywhere. Amelia Mason wasn't afraid, nor did she try to stop him. If this outburst could ease His Majesty's frustration, then let him be. Though unconcerned with affairs of state, she knew these were trying times for His Majesty, whose new policies faced constant opposition. The she His Majesty referred to was Princess Rose Windsor, and the him was her only son, Prince Vincent Wilder of Arlingham. She had read some of the minister's accusatory memorials against him: deceit, brawling, harassing women, bullying commoners. His Majesty had endured it all in silence, out of respect for Princess Rose Windsor. When she was 14, the late Emperor had given her in marriage to General Wilder, recently returned victorious from the border, as a reward, even though General Wilder was over 70 at the time. Less than a year after their marriage, General Wilder fell ill and died. A princess held a high position as the emperor's daughter, but no matter how lofty her status, for the sake of the nation and power, she could become a sacrificial pawn, a kind of sorrow in itself. Amelia Mason couldn't help but feel fortunate that she wasn't born into the imperial family, spared such humiliation. She looked at His Majesty's face, flushed with anger. In the 2 years of their marriage, she had rarely seen him happy. Few in the court truly supported him. So much was forced upon him, so many burdens he bore, he must be utterly exhausted. A surge of affection welled up within her, making her forget her position. She embraced His Majesty's head against her chest, gently stroking his back, softly comforting him. Don't be angry. Let's not be angry anymore. There's a solution to everything. Tomorrow, everything will be all right. His Majesty stiffened, both irritated and amused. His Empress was soothing him like a child. Yet, this small gesture moved him deeply. As the Emperor, perceived as a god by all, only in her eyes was he a child in need of affection. He didn't push her away, letting her tenderness flow. After a while, the young woman seemed to realize her actions, abruptly releasing him and stepping back, blushing as she looked at him, the perspiration on her face increasing. Lest he frighten her, His Majesty suppressed a smile, feigning composure. Thank you, Empress. I truly feel much better. That's good, that's good. She fiddled with her sleeve, wanting to smile naturally, but suddenly felt dizzy. Everything in the room seemed to spin. She reached out for support, finding only air. Darkness consumed her as she collapsed into His Majesty's arms. Heavens, it seemed she had committed a grave impropriety. She tried to regain her composure but couldn't, succumbing to unconsciousness. His Majesty couldn't believe the young woman who had just been comforting him like a mother was now unconscious. He gently lifted her and placed her on the small bed in the room. Touching her, he immediately noticed her outer robe was soaked, assuming she had fainted from the heat. Someone, he calmly called out. Upon opening the door and seeing the Empress in this state, Grace Mason rushed to her side in alarm. Your Majesty, what's wrong? The commotion she'd heard from outside the room had startled her, and this scene only solidified her belief that her mistress was being wronged. But the Empress always adhered to palace protocol, so what could have possibly happened? Eunuch Lawrence Park, summon the royal physician. The Empress has caught a chill. Grace Mason, find a lighter robe for Her Majesty, her current attire is too heavy. Grace Mason assented and moved to help the Empress to her bedchamber, but a longer arm reached out first, gently scooping the Empress up and carrying her into the room, laying her down upon the bed. Attend to her well. Report to Celestial Hall after court. Gazing at the delicate face on the bed, he longed to stay and care for her, but fearing her embarrassment, he instructed Grace Mason and turned to leave. After this flurry of activity, His Majesty noted the lightening sky. The rain had ceased at some point, leaving the air heavy and oppressive. It was nearly time for court. Chapter 2, A Chance Encounter, and I Choose to Adore You. In the 9th month, the osmanthus bloomed, their sweet fragrance permeating the air, drifting near and far. Two ancient osmanthus trees graced the palace grounds, their perfume wafting since early autumn. The court ladies delighted in gathering the blossoms, tucking them into their sleeves, their movements trailed by the flower's scent. Like chrysanthemums, the osmanthus came in a variety of hues, white, yellow, purple, red, adorning every corner of the royal palace with their delicate beauty. Autumn was the most beautiful season in the palace. Yet, a heavy atmosphere hung over the Ministry of Education today. The princes, recently dismissed from their lessons, remained seated, their eyes following the restless pacing of Grand Tutor Mason. Seated apart were His Majesty and Prince Carter. Grand Tutor Mason, the top scholar of the previous dynasty, possessed extraordinary talent. The current His Majesty, disregarding his status as a minister of the former court, valued his brilliance and personally visited the Mason estate to invite him to tutor the princes. Humbled by the emperor's gesture, Grand Tutor Mason dedicated himself to his task, though the results were, alas, inversely proportional to his efforts. Today, His Majesty had unexpectedly set aside state affairs to observe the prince's progress, causing the Grand Tutor considerable anxiety. The current emperor had few children. Consumed by years of war, he had little inclination for family life, only taking wives and concubines after securing the kingdom, resulting in 3 sons and 5 daughters. The eldest, Crown Prince Alexander Windsor, born to the Empress, was pampered from birth and possessed an arrogant disposition, frequently causing trouble within the palace. The second son, Sebastian Windsor, born to His Majesty's most favored concubine, was the opposite of Alexander, quiet and reserved. The third son, Edward Windsor, was the product of a winter night when His Majesty, weary from reviewing memorials, glanced up to see a refined and serene serving girl, her presence as clear as water. His heart quickened, and that night he lay with her. She conceived, and due to her pregnancy, was elevated to the rank of Jehu. Sadly, her fortune was short-lived. She died in childbirth from blood loss, her family name remaining unknown. Edward Windsor, deprived of his mother and lacking a father's guidance, was raised by nurses and court ladies, enduring scorn and ridicule from a young age. This harsh environment forced him to mature quickly, learning to navigate the treacherous currents of palace life. He understood that he could rely only on himself. Alexander, in the book of poetry writes, "I give you a papaya, you repay me with fine jade. Is this not repayment? It will forever be good." See the end of chapter notes for further explanation. How do you interpret these lines? His Majesty looked kindly at his eldest son, his voice gentle. This was his firstborn, born of the Queen, and he held great expectations for him. Alexander Windsor pondered for a moment, then spoke fluidly. The poem speaks of 2 people who love each other, but I find the writer foolish. Who would exchange a piece of jade for a mere papaya? However, if the other person were the emperor, it would make sense. If the emperor shows even a little kindness to his subjects, they must repay him with their lives. This is not repayment, but loyalty. Oh. And what do you consider a little kindness to be? His Majesty raised an eyebrow, displeasure beginning to show on his face. Just a small favor is enough. They are servants of the royal family. Do they delude themselves into thinking they deserve anything better? Alexander Windsor spoke excitedly, a smug look on his face. You know that this kingdom was built upon the lives of countless soldiers. A small favor is enough. What else can be done? Make them His Majesty. The lives of servants are cheap. One more or one less makes no difference. Why should father care about them? One who does not love the people, does not value the people, how can they be a good emperor? His Majesty looked at Grand Tutor Mason with disappointment, his mood sinking. Grand Tutor Mason lowered his head and sighed deeply, not daring to look at His Majesty. The second prince watched the unfolding situation with undisguised glee. His Majesty noticed and asked, "Sebastian, in the past, there was a monarch named Andrew Hart. He was very old, and he asked his ministers to recommend a talented successor to the throne. The ministers replied, 'Doesn't he have many capable sons? He answered, "No, my sons are cruel and savage, they cannot handle such a position." What do you think of this story? Sebastian Windsor's pale face flushed. Is there such a monarch in this world? To struggle to gain a kingdom and then hand it over to another? Truly a selfish act. He may be praised by history, but what about his sons? Born princes, yet forced to bow their heads as subjects to another. He was not a good father. What if you consider it from the perspective of the people? Even then, it cannot be. The kingdom of our ancestors should be inherited by their descendants. That monarch had no right to give it to another. All right. So, according to this natural order, the throne must be passed to the eldest son. Even if the eldest is incompetent, he cannot pass it to the second son. No, the kingdom of our family must be passed to the most capable. The second prince seemed agitated, his voice rising. Oh. How do you distinguish between capable and incompetent? Your Majesty, the strong prevail. The victor becomes king. The emperor stared blankly at Sebastian Windsor, his already low spirits turning icy. He paced the study in frustration. A small figure sitting at the back caught his eye. He suddenly remembered he had another son. Why was his face bruised in some places? "Edward, what happened to your face?" Edward Windsor stood up and respectfully replied, "Your Majesty, I was careless during martial arts practice." You enjoy martial arts? Yes, martial arts training cultivates strength and allows for self-defense. Not bad, Edward. What about your studies? His Majesty held little hope, lest he receive an answer that would utterly despair him. I do not enjoy reading. Edward Windsor's clear eyes held a frank and resolute expression. Why? The royal tutor says knowledge of the past and present, and understanding of sages and virtuous men, will be beneficial for governing the country in the future. I have 2 intelligent and capable elder brothers, so this matter needn't concern me. I believe protecting myself is sufficient. Are you in a dangerous situation? His Majesty found it puzzling why his son kept mentioning self-preservation. No, Your Majesty. Edward Windsor's voice lowered. It was just that his 2 elder brothers and the princesses, with nothing better to do, often treated him like a ball to kick around or a servant to tease. If he couldn't fight back, couldn't he at least run away? But escaping effectively wasn't easy, hence his dedication to martial arts. His Majesty didn't pursue the matter further, his mood considerably darkened. If you were to govern a country, how would you do it? I don't know. Think before you speak. I'm asking hypothetically, not literally. Yes, Your Majesty. In that case, I believe that to be a monarch, one must be a truly great individual, surpassing others, to command their loyalty in obedience. That would certainly be ideal. But a monarch is also just a person, not superior in every aspect. What then? Edward Windsor thought for a moment before replying, then they must command respect through their virtue. A capable monarch can recruit talented individuals as advisors to assist in governing the country. This was the first time Edward Windsor had spoken to his father at such length, and a hint of shyness appeared on his lively young face. His Majesty's heart swelled with joy. And what constitutes such virtue? A strong body, meaning excellent martial arts skills, patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to judge and utilize people. He frowned, unable to think of anything further, and dejectedly lowered his head. What about literary accomplishments? That, Edward Windsor thought, was a headache. Literary pursuits were for exceptionally brilliant individuals. It didn't matter if a monarch lacked such skills. Seeing his son's pained expression, His Majesty smiled and stood up. Royal Tutor Mason looked at His Majesty apologetically, bowing slightly. Your Majesty, please appoint someone more capable. I am incompetent and unable to teach the crown princes. How can this be blamed on the royal tutor? His Majesty understood his son's temperament. In the future, please pay more attention to Edward. His dislike for reading is unbecoming of a prince. Royal tutor Mason shook his head. The third prince's situation was unique. He always appeared cautious during lessons, unable to focus on even a single line or sentence. Gradually, he began to reject books altogether, and no amount of coercion could make him read a single line. Seeing the Grand Preceptor's troubled expression, His Majesty said, "I specifically permit you to take the third prince back to your estate for his education. Perhaps a change of scenery would lessen Edward's guarded nature." Grand Preceptor Mason was astonished, but seeing Duke Carter nod at him, he quickly replied, "Your decree is my command." His Majesty, observing the stunned expressions of his eldest and second sons, sighed wearily and left the room. "Your Majesty, have you seen clearly?" Duke Carter softly inquired. His Majesty gazed towards the distant city walls beyond the palace gates. "One with short-sighted arrogance, another with savage brutality, how can I entrust this kingdom to them? And the last one is still an unpolished stone, requiring careful shaping." Duke Carter chuckled. "That stone isn't so simple either. To survive at such a young age within the complexities of the royal palace is no small feat. Indeed, I've shown him the least affection, often neglecting him." His Majesty turned to face Duke Carter, his voice solemn. "Brother, I ask you to have William befriend him. William carries the warmth of the sun, which can thaw Edward's chill. Prolonged exposure to the palace. I fear his heart will darken as well. Ask. You want me to die young? Just let Edward stay with me. That would also be good. Outside the palace, he will likely mature better. He was his only hope. He mustn't make any more mistakes." Anxiety gnawed at His Majesty's heart. Grand Preceptor Mason, a man who cherished tranquility and flora, had his estate situated in the suburbs. 3 main houses, 2 smaller southern wings, and a meticulously clean courtyard in between. All manner of flowers and trees lined the walls, and beside the main house stood a small pavilion housing a bookshelf overflowing with volumes. 12-year-old Edward Windsor, experiencing his first venture outside the palace, was filled with delight. Surrounded by lush greenery, blue skies, and white clouds, his spirit felt like a young blade of grass bathed in sunlight, free and unrestrained. Upon entering the Mason estate courtyard, the vibrant and lively scenery captivated him. He curiously touched everything, careful not to disturb the beauty around him. "Third Prince, this is my wife and daughter," Grand Preceptor Mason announced gently. Edward Windsor turned, his gaze still lingering on the foliage. Beside Grand Preceptor Mason stood a modest, dignified woman, holding the hand of a 3 or 4-year-old girl. The girl's hair was tied in 2 buns, her eyes sparkled like stars, her eyelashes curved like crescent moons, and her rosy cheeks resembled freshly bloomed peach blossoms, utterly adorable. The little girl, mimicking her mother, curtsied slightly. Her childish voice rang out, "Greetings, Your Highness." A warmth Edward Windsor had never known washed over him. He gently knelt, taking the little girl's soft, white hands in his. "My name is Edward Windsor. What's yours?" "Amelia Mason." Clear breeze from afar, faint sound without echo. Shy in his presence, she replied before hiding behind her mother. "Third Prince, please follow me to the pavilion to read." Since understanding His Majesty's intentions, the Grand Preceptor hadn't dared to delay. A few days later, he brought the third prince to his estate for tutoring, determined not to waste a single moment. Edward Windsor reluctantly followed the Grand Tutor into the study pavilion. The gentle breeze, the fragrant flowers, and the occasional flitting dragonflies all distracted him. He couldn't concentrate, the dense lines of text simply wouldn't enter his eyes, and the Grand Tutor's lecture was like a lullaby. This was the 100th time Grand Tutor Mason had cried without tears. "Your Highness, let's take a break. I'll withdraw for now." He simply couldn't complete the task His Majesty had entrusted him with. "Yes, go ahead." Edward Windsor nodded happily. He had long been tired of these books. For the past few days, the Grand Tutor had been diligently pressing him to read, saying he would need it in the future. But what use would he have for it? Having not trained for a few days, he felt his bones were a bit sluggish, so he immediately stood up, stretched, and then, unprepared, jumped when he saw Amelia Mason staring at him with wide, round eyes, a puzzled look on her face. "Don't you like reading?" "No, the sight of words gives me a headache." He squatted down in front of the little girl, fiddling with the flowers she wore in her hair. A faint, refreshing fragrance emanated from her, making him unable to resist the urge to get closer. "There are so many good stories in books. Why don't you like them?" She frowned slightly, unable to understand why anyone wouldn't like reading. "You know how to read?" Edward Windsor was astonished. How old was this little girl? Amelia Mason nodded seriously. He chuckled. "How many words do you know?" The little girl's chubby arm pointed to the rows of books on the shelves. "I've read all of those over there, and I've memorized them too. Father says the ones over there are a bit mysterious, and I'll understand them when I'm a little older." "All of those?" He couldn't believe it as he looked at the rows of books, looking left and right, up and down. It seemed like there must be over 100 books. "Yes." "Who do you like the most? Was he a king?" Amelia Mason's small face lit up with adoration. "He was a great hero, a true warrior. He was chivalrous and helped his friends. He kept his promises, even if it meant risking his life." As she spoke, tears welled up in her eyes. Edward Windsor stood there, stunned and speechless. He didn't know who the little girl was talking about, nor did he understand her emotions. He was simply shocked. "I also like Lord Charles Green. Although he often finds himself in difficult situations, he has many resourceful people who help him overcome danger. The stories about him are extremely interesting, like Martin Steele's Self-Advancement, The Trick of Rooster and Dog." "Hey, why aren't you saying anything?" The autumn season, the autumn colors, and the autumn scenery blended with the little girl's sincere demeanor and enamored expression. "You are truly remarkable," he murmured, then sighed to himself. Notes: This is a poem by Confucius. "The quince you gave, I toss aside, my jade, beautiful and precious, I offer in return. Not to repay a debt, my dear, but to foster friendship, enduring and true." Quince, Bengal quince, the fruit is like a small melon, sour, edible. Quin, the beauty of jade. Jade ornament, the name of a type of jade worn as jewelry. It says that if someone gives you a small, humble gift, you should reciprocate with something precious and valuable, and even that is not enough to repay them, but rather a desire to cultivate a good relationship and never forget each other. This is also a sentiment of love between a man and a woman, similar to the one in the chapter, Quiet Maiden. Martin Steele self-promoted. Martin Steele nominated himself. When the Qin army besieged the Zhao state, Lord Charles Green of Zhao had to seek help from the Chu state. His disciple, Martin Steele, volunteered to accompany him. There, thanks to Martin Steele's talent, Lord Charles Green achieved the desired success. The Trick of Rooster and Dog, an anecdote in the Records of the Grand Historian about Lord David Reed. During the Warring States period, Lord David Reed of the Kingdom of Qi recruited all sorts of people as retainers, and was known to have 3,000 guests. He never refused any guest, as long as they were useful, regardless of their methods. At the invitation of Emperor Alexander the Resolute, Lord David Reed of Qi, along with several retainers, journeyed to visit the land of Alexander, bringing with him a very rare white sable coat as a gift for the emperor. Later, Emperor Alexander felt that Lord David Reed, being a Qi nobleman, could not be employed, but also felt that he knew too much about Alexander's affairs, so he did not want him to return home and kept him under loose guard in Alexander's kingdom. Emperor Alexander's younger brother, General Kane, informed Lord David Reed of this and told him to seek help from Sophia Bennet, Emperor Alexander's most favored person. Unexpectedly, Sophia Bennet set a difficult condition: he had to give her the precious white sable coat before she would plead with Emperor Alexander. Lord David Reed, anxious and unsure what to do, discussed the matter with his companions. Later, someone sitting at the back of the group said, "I will sneak into the palace and steal the white sable coat that we gave to Emperor Alexander." Lord David Reed quickly asked, "How will you steal it?" The man replied, "I will pretend to be a dog and sneak in to steal it." Indeed, this man did not disappoint everyone's expectations, and that very night, he successfully retrieved the sable coat and gave it to Sophia Bennet. At her request, Emperor Alexander agreed to release Lord David Reed. Lord David Reed, fearing the emperor might go back on his word, immediately left Alexander's kingdom. But when they reached Hanggu Pass, the roosters had not yet crowed, and the city gates were still closed. At this moment, one of the retainers imitated the sound of a rooster crowing, and immediately the roosters around them also flapped their wings and crowed along. The city gates opened, and the whole group escaped. King Alexander did indeed regret his actions, but by then it was too late. Nowadays, people still use the idiom, "chickens cry, dogs path," to refer to insignificant skills or lowly behavior. Chapter 3, Though plentiful as clouds, none are what I desire. This sentence means, even if there are as many as the clouds, they are not what I want. Edward Windsor felt himself maturing, truly. Although royal tutor Mason still shook his head while watching him study, although Uncle Carter's gaze held increasing worry, although his father still scolded him after reviewing his lessons, he no longer ran away. He understood that facing problems solved more than avoiding them. He also knew he wasn't some world-shaking genius, but he could be a knight, a general, a man dedicated to righteous deeds. Yet, he didn't know why, but he always felt that wasn't enough, a sense of unease, a premonition of impending turmoil. For the royal court, this year was truly a year of chaos. In just 1 year, His Majesty caught a cold, and for months, his health hasn't improved. The ministers and consorts are all deeply worried. But there were also those who believed their opportunity had arrived. That night, Crown Prince Alexander Windsor, under the guise of a visit, conspired with several court officials to launch a coup, forcing the king to abdicate. Fortunately, Prince Carter and Chancellor Adrian Blake had anticipated this. Alexander Windsor, defeated, committed suicide. The Queen collapsed. His Majesty, enraged, coughed up blood. Corpses littered the ground, blood staining the royal palace, a scene of unspeakable carnage. Meanwhile, the royal consort and the second prince stood aloof, rejoicing. Edward Windsor was quietly taken to Carter Manor. Edward Windsor loved being at Carter Manor. It was the family he'd always imagined, a tall, imposing father, a gentle, kind mother, and even a spoiled little sister. He envied William Carter for having such a happy life. No wonder he was always smiling, a smile like sunshine, disarming everyone. Unlike him, forever dwelling in shadows, where a moment's carelessness would be swallowed by the darkness. Little Lady Emily Carter was adorable. She would run and cling to him whenever she saw him. She couldn't read yet, so she'd babble at him endlessly. He had several princess sisters, but because they had different mothers, they felt like strangers, no different from commoners when they met. And his elder brothers, each one made his heart grow cold. This family captivated him, so much so that sometimes he considered himself one of them. Edward Windsor knew Uncle Carter helped his father seize the throne, a great meritorious official. Not only that, but he was also His Majesty's best friend, like brothers, only lacking the same surname. His Majesty deeply trusted Uncle Carter. It could be said that Uncle Carter was the only person His Majesty would entrust his life to. But he still didn't understand why Uncle Carter treated him differently. When they talked, Uncle Carter often discussed state affairs with him, the roles of the current ministers, the situation at the border, the lives of the common people, words laced with profound implications that piqued his curiosity. While William, clearly younger than him, always seemed carefree, yet outside, he always treated Edward like an older brother, shielding him, protecting him. Isn't he just a prince in name only? Why is he treated like this? Noticing Edward Windsor's melancholic silence during his recent visits, William Carter thought of a place sure to lift his spirits. He casually set down his military texts and feigned spontaneity. "Third Prince, it's dreary being cooped up all day. Fancy a trip to the countryside?" Edward Windsor shook his head. With the current court turmoil and him staying at Manor Carter, he worried about his father, the king. Could everything truly be this simple? "If you don't want to go out, I'll just continue reading. I was planning to visit Grand Tutor Mason's estate." Edward Windsor looked up. Since his 18th birthday, the Grand Tutor had withdrawn to a life of scholarship, and they'd rarely met. Today presented a perfect opportunity, but palace gossip could tarnish outside connections. Visiting Mason Estate might bring the Grand Tutor unwanted trouble. After a moment's thought, he stood. "Let's go to Mason Estate." Seeing William Carter nod, Edward Windsor couldn't help but steal another glance. His younger brother, William, grew more handsome with age. Mason Estate remained its usual tranquil self, the courtyard fragrant with blossoms. Beyond the palms, Edward Windsor saw Lady Mason embroidering a banner on the veranda, Grand Tutor Mason writing at a small table in the shade, and Amelia Mason engrossed in a book, leaning back in a pavilion chair. A gentle breeze rustled her skirt, she smoothed it without ever lifting her gaze from the page. Edward Windsor stared, transfixed. Had she grown taller in the year since they last met? The childish hair ribbons were gone, replaced by jewelry like other girls. Her youthful charm had blossomed into an elegant grace that captivated him. During his days reading at Mason Estate, she had seemed like a little old woman in his eyes. Lady Mason held her to high standards, which she, in turn, imposed on him, adding a gentle, "Be good and study hard." He hadn't known whether to laugh or cry, but he couldn't refuse her earnestness. She was a demanding child, and he dared not underestimate her. A gentle smile played on Edward Windsor's lips. "William, my brother, what do you think of Miss Mason?" William Carter glanced at Amelia, then looked away. "Not much different from Emily." "How can you say that?" "Emily is several years younger." William Carter looked at him, puzzled. Was there a difference? Weren't they both just children? "William, don't underestimate her because of her age. She's incredibly sharp, a veritable library. I'm almost intimidated by her." "Why?" "I feel like a fool around her." "Haha, Third Prince, you're too modest. You're resourceful, brave, and honorable. How could you be a fool?" William Carter asked, curious. Edward Windsor, not entirely without shame, chuckled. "I can't help it. Whenever I'm near her, I break out in a sweat. It's all right if you don't enjoy reading. Everyone has different interests and strengths. A prince will have great responsibilities, being intimidated by a girl would be laughable." He didn't elaborate. No matter how many books she read, she was confined to the women's quarters, her knowledge useless. He sensed the prince's peculiar reverence for her and didn't want to offend him. "Ha ha." Lu Luyan glanced once more at the small figure, then, fearing being seen by passers-by, the two hurriedly left. "Brother William, what kind of woman do you fancy?" Edward Windsor suddenly asked on their way back. William Carter, startled, blushed slightly. At 17, he'd never considered such things. "I don't know, certainly not a child." "Are you sure about that?" "Yes." William Carter nodded firmly. What was there to like about a drooling little one? He didn't know that, more than 10 years later, he would be utterly captivated by such a girl. "Speaking of which, your highness is nearly 20, surely marriage is on the horizon. Have you anyone in mind?" Edward Windsor gave a wry smile. "That's not for me to decide. Unlike you, Brother William, I can't choose whom I adore. Besides, I hardly know any noblewomen." As he spoke, the budding of first love made him imagine holding someone close. William Carter smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. The two walked back to Carter Manor. As they reached the street corner, they saw Alfred Carter, the steward of Carter Manor, anxiously pacing at the gate. Exchanging a glance, they quickened their steps. "Your Highness, you're back. Quickly, someone from the palace has come, urging your immediate return." "Alfred Carter, do we know the messenger?" William Carter asked cautiously. "It's His Majesty's lieutenant, young master. There's no need to worry," Alfred Carter replied in a low voice. Hearing the announcement, the lieutenant and the royal guards emerged from the manor. "Your Highness, take care." William Carter gripped Edward Windsor's hand tightly. Edward nodded solemnly, his eyes filled with resolve. On the journey, Edward Windsor's hands trembled, his heart in his throat. Something must have happened at the palace for such an urgent summons. The carriage sped swiftly. Arriving at the palace gates, they proceeded directly to His Majesty's study. Lord Carter, waiting anxiously at the door, breathed a sigh of relief at Edward's arrival. "Your Highness, we've been waiting for you. His Majesty awaits inside. You must obey him. Is father feeling better?" Edward Windsor asked hopefully. "You'll see when you go in. I'll wait for you here." Edward Windsor pushed open the door and entered. The room was silent. The last rays of sunset streamed through the window, illuminating a figure reclining on a chair. It was His Majesty, who at this moment, resembled not a god ruling over his people, but an aging father, a flickering flame nearing its end. Seeing his father like this, Edward Windsor's eyes welled up. He knelt before him, clutching his frail arm, and wept openly. "Edward." His Majesty tried to raise a hand to stroke his son's head, but lacked the strength. Tears streamed down his face. "Edward, I intended to wait until you were older to place the kingdom upon your shoulders, but life is unpredictable. I no longer have the strength. Now, you must bear this burden." These few words exhausted His Majesty, his breathing labored. Edward Windsor shook his head vehemently, sobbing like a child. He had lost his mother, and now, after finally receiving his father's love, how could he bear to watch him go? "I don't want to, father." "You must. Of all my sons, only you possess a loyal heart and a forgiving spirit. I can only entrust this kingdom to you. You must protect it well, Edward. The higher you climb, the colder it gets. Never trust easily. In court, you can rely on a few veteran officials like your Uncle Carter, Chancellor Adrian Blake, and General Thompson. But within these palace walls, you must arrange your defenses carefully. I failed to find a good queen. Don't repeat my mistake. Edward, royal consorts can be as fleeting as birds in flight or fish in the deep, but the queen must be profoundly righteous, someone you can completely trust. Only with a peaceful harem can you govern the nation with peace of mind." His words growing lengthy, His Majesty, with clouded eyes, looked at Edward Windsor with a resigned gaze, his breath shallow and weak. "I understand, father." Edward Windsor gently wiped his father's tears. Suddenly, the study door was kicked open, and Consortly rushed in, screaming, along with the second prince. "Your Majesty, father." Consortly dramatically prostrated herself over His Majesty, sobbing uncontrollably. Sebastian Windsor shoved Edward Windsor aside, his face grim, and coldly asked, "What wicked scheme brought you to bring father here?" Edward Windsor struggled against his brother's grip. "I have no scheme." "Then what were you two whispering about?" Sebastian Windsor lunged forward again, grabbing Edward's collar, his eyes bloodshot. Consortly stopped crying and joined in, pulling at Edward as well. "Release the third prince." Duke Carter and Chancellor Adrian Blake, leading a group of officials, entered and pulled the two apart. "His Majesty is in such a state, and you still squabble. Have you no conscience?" Duke Carter said sorrowfully. His Majesty's face was pale. Seeing Duke Carter, he smiled weakly. Royal brother, I entrust Edward to you. Duke Carter nodded tearfully. Today, I declare to all under heaven, I bequeath the throne to my third son, Edward Windsor. With these final words, His Majesty gave a faint smile and peacefully passed away. Everyone in the room knelt, bidding farewell to the late emperor and acknowledging the new emperor. Among the crowd, Sebastian Windsor's eyes flashed with envy and hatred. Consortly, holding her son's hand, wept bitterly. The late emperor's passing brought grief to the entire nation. A month later, he was laid to rest in the royal mausoleum. In the autumn of the same year, Duke Carter, overworked, followed the late emperor in death. Edward Windsor sat in the Golden Lone Palace, gazing at the layers of doors, the tiers of steps, the eunuchs standing on both sides, and the civil and military officials lined up in orderly rows below. This was true authority. He finally felt the weight of ruling all under heaven. It all felt like a dream. No, not a dream. He wouldn't dare to dream of such a thing. Edward Windsor gave a bitter smile as he saw Chancellor Adrian Blake step out from the ranks. Your Majesty, tradition dictates that princes, upon reaching adulthood, should not remain within the palace. The second prince is 26 this year and has been married for several years. I request Your Majesty issue a decree for the second prince to leave the palace and reside at Carter Manor. Edward Windsor nodded. With his father gone, his second brother's gaze held only resentment. It was best for him to leave. Your Majesty, with the new emperor's ascension, the harem cannot remain without a mistress. Your Majesty should also marry soon. Marry? Edward Windsor had no concept of such a thing, but he knew his. Marriage was now a matter of state, not to be taken lightly. He cautiously asked, are there any suitable daughters of court officials? The daughter of the late founding official, General Thompson, is beautiful and wise, well-read, and understands propriety. Her age is also suitable for Your Majesty, one official suggested. The Duchess, daughter of the Princess Royal and the Duke Bennett, is 28 this year, intelligent, quick-witted, beautiful, and lovely. Another voice added. Edward Windsor looked at the crowd below, a slight smile playing on William Carter's face, and he understood somewhat. Whichever noble lady marries His Majesty, her family will become royal relatives, His Majesty's own family, and naturally, they will wield unparalleled power. Such an opportunity, any official with a daughter would naturally seize it, and those without would choose a side to bask in the reflected glory. But whom should he marry now? Both families were important officials, meritorious officials, and having just ascended the throne, he couldn't disrespect these officials. I have just ascended the throne and am busy with state affairs. All the noble ladies will enter the palace as consorts. As for the Empress, we'll discuss it in a few years. That would do, he wouldn't offend anyone. Both the Duke Bennett and General Thompson were slightly disappointed, but being able to enter the palace was good. Who would give birth to the first prince was still unknown, and wasn't the Queen's chambers still vacant? William Carter nodded to Edward Windsor in approval. On their wedding day, red candles illuminated the royal palace, lanterns casting their glow everywhere. Beneath the silk veil, the imperial consort was charming and captivating, shy like a newly bloomed flower. Edward Windsor gently embraced the beauty, bestowing a tender kiss. With two new imperial consorts in the palace, shadows began to spread from within the very light of the royal palace. Amidst the busyness, palace maids and eunuchs often gossiped, unable to guess which consort His Majesty favored more. He worked diligently, reviewing memorials in his study every night until dawn, and sighs could still be heard through the window. He would occasionally spend the night with Clara Thompson and then, naturally, with Sophia Bennett the next. His Majesty seemed to be balancing the two, neither having an advantage over the other. His Majesty, though young, is not overly concerned with women. Edward Windsor overheard the conversation of two eunuchs in the hallway and chuckled, shaking his head. Perhaps due to a lack of love in his childhood, the affection within him was minimal, more than half replaced by responsibility. He was wary of everyone, not close to anyone. The imperial consorts loved him for his position as His Majesty, and after a few intimate encounters, they would whisper in his ear, seeking positions for their relatives. It was natural to care for one's family, and he wouldn't be indifferent to anyone, but the already scarce affection in his heart faded even more. These were trivial matters, not worth dwelling on. Currently, his biggest worry was. He looked at the memorials piled up like a small mountain in front of him, his head throbbing. He wondered if Royal Tutor Mason would weep if he saw him like this. Royal Tutor Mason. Edward Windsor suddenly remembered Amelia Mason. It had been 2 years since they last met, and her knowledge must have deepened considerably. A gentle breeze always blows, a great sound has no echo. Thinking of her, Edward Windsor's mood brightened. If she were to see these memorials, she could probably understand them with a quick glance. Gradually, Edward Windsor's heart beat faster, a thought flashing through his mind. She read books and recited poetry, her writing flowed effortlessly. She was brilliant, with a photographic memory. She was gentle, well-mannered, and erudite. She was pure, kind, elegant, and righteous. Wouldn't it be a pity for such a woman not to preside over the Queen's chambers? His Queen's chambers. Edward Windsor smiled mischievously. How could she bear to refuse him? Chapter 4, Ton remained silent, and my heart was filled with worry. Night fell, and within the king's study, the palace maids had already lit the lanterns, emitting a fragrant aroma that dispelled the dampness. The dry season's showers persisted day after day, making it undesirable to look out the window for fear of melancholy, and opening it would only worsen the damp-induced ailments. The fragrance offered some relief, making the humid interior feel more airy, and lifting the spirits of those within. Damp-induced ailments, symptoms such as sores on the hands or feet. Amelia Mason, having only recently recovered, her complexion still somewhat pale, tired easily after standing for a while. Seeing the royal palanquin not headed her way, she sought solace in a book, engrossed in its pages as she casually flipped through them. Read the history of crystal snow, and take serene jade as an example. Read the works of moonlit companionship, and follow the sage of guidance. Read the scriptures to ponder the proper conduct with beautiful women, so as to avoid needless misfortune. Read the Atlas of Myths Water Sutra, to understand gentle petals as lean bamboo, glacial rock terrace, and the restraint of endless desires. After reading this passage, Amelia Mason's lips curled into a slight, disdainful smile. From a young age, she had been exceptionally bright, comprehending all the history books by the age of 6, and mastering Confucian classics by 10. The book of poetry, and the teachings, were all familiar to her. Her father occasionally took her out to meet learned scholars, engaging in discussions where she often challenged them. She knew, 10,000 books in hand, the heart rejoices, ceasing to read brings joy, closing the book brings laughter, but she couldn't fathom how reading could ruin a person's character. Surely they must have been so engrossed in reading that they became foolish. Could one truly read oneself into a daze, making one's character pure yet cold, devoid of ambition? Confucian Classics, the Essence and Standards of Confucianism. Your Majesty. Edward Windsor, upon entering, immediately caught the sweet scent of plum blossoms. Under the lamplight, Amelia Mason sat with her eyes half closed, silent. Today, she was dressed casually, her attire elegant, her jewelry simple, resembling an unmarried maiden, refined and innocent. Catching His Majesty captivated by her, she blushed, a shy smile gracing her lips. Court was dismissed later than usual today, Your Majesty. But Edward Windsor's face showed no signs of fatigue. He spoke joyfully, the flood in the riverlands has receded, and the displaced people can return to their homes and begin working again. The border has sent news of victory against our neighboring country. I am truly overjoyed today. Amelia Mason's eyes lit up with delight. I congratulate Your Majesty, the good news of summer has arrived. So, no need to review memorials tonight then. Such joyous occasions should be celebrated with all officials, high and low. Otherwise, perhaps seek the company of the 2 imperial consorts to admire the moonlit flowers. I heard from eunuch Lawrence Park that your majesty has been neglecting the 2 consorts these past few days, and the palace has been devoid of cheer for 2 days now. Why? Edward Windsor, not the least bit offended by her words, casually inquired, thinking she wouldn't care, but he always wanted to share the good news with her, his queen, first. Amelia Mason turned back with a soft chuckle. The servants thought your majesty has been weary for so long and should rest more. You're also trying to guess my thoughts. Oh. She feigned surprise, then sighed. All right, I'll review the memorials. The memorials were placed on His Majesty's regal desk, the palace maids having prepared the inkstone, and the documents neatly arranged to the side. Edward Windsor narrowed his eyes, watching her indifferent expression as she sat down and opened a memorial. He'd seen this scene hundreds of times, yet today it irked him. It wasn't that she wasn't fit to be queen, but she seemed unconcerned with palace affairs, always alone in the study reading, even reviewing memorials at night. Her interactions with everyone were marked by a pale indifference, giving the impression that nothing truly mattered to her, that nothing could ruffle her composure. She never paid him any attention, never proactively inquired about his troubles, her gaze never held a hint of affection. Only on that stormy night did her maternal compassion warm his heart. She was like a scholar, not a queen. Other scholars might engage in flattery and gossip, but she was like an outsider in the palace, her body present but her mind elsewhere. This realization made Edward Windsor shudder. What was his queen truly thinking? He stole a glance at her. There aren't many memorials today. I'll heed your advice, my queen, and not dwell on state affairs tonight. Let's relax. Edward Windsor's eyes were dark and deep as he gazed intently at Amelia Mason. As expected, she joyfully set down her pen. Thank you, your majesty. Then I shall return to my chambers. She neatly arranged the memorials, handed them to the court lady behind her, smiled gently, and rose to leave the study. She hadn't expected His Majesty to be already standing before the stack of memorials, gently taking her hand and leading her to the small bed beside the bookshelves. My queen, let's talk tonight. He embraced her and they sat down together. Oh. Amelia Mason numbly sat down with him, lowering her head, waiting for his questions to which she would reply. They had never been this close, and she felt somewhat uncomfortable. Edward Windsor dismissed the court ladies. Looking at her docile appearance, he felt both exasperated and amused. My queen, you don't enjoy reviewing memorials, do you? He asked softly, afraid of startling her. She lifted her head and shook it. It's not that I dislike it, nor do I particularly like it. These are matters of state, not a matter of preference. I promise to serve your majesty, so I should shoulder some of your burdens. I will strive to do my best. Personal preferences are irrelevant. She was always so straightforward and sincere, a quality Edward Windsor admired. I feel the same. When the late emperor entrusted the kingdom to me in this very room, I felt utterly helpless. I struggled internally. I would have preferred to be a general, free to roam the battlefield. But I am the late emperor's son, I cannot indulge my desires. My queen, I have caused you hardship. He couldn't help it, he had forced her into this situation. He gently clasped her small, slender hand and spoke sincerely. Live by one's will, to follow one's heart's desires, Amelia Mason looked at His Majesty in surprise. Despite her intelligence, she couldn't understand why he would say such a thing. She swallowed and carefully replied, I am your Majesty's queen. Performing these duties is only natural. Edward Windsor nodded. My queen, have you ever considered what your life would be like if you weren't queen? Married to a talented man, living a harmonious life, reciting poetry together by the window? The image that appeared before Edward Windsor's eyes filled him with a pang of envy. To retreat to the mountains and forests, she stated firmly. To build a small wooden house in the woods, plant some flowers and herbs, listen to the birds sing, watch the flowers and grass sway, drink spring water, eat vegetarian food, live freely and peacefully, and read books day and night. Edward Windsor's eyes widened, staring at her for a long time before returning to his usual demeanor. "My queen, why do you have such thoughts?" He had considered countless answers, but never that she, though not young, desired the leisurely pursuits of a hermit. The ancients said, by studying history, we can understand the rise and fall of nations, and we can also see the various ancient evils that still exist today. History is like a mirror. This is from the perspective of the entire nation. Correspondingly, on a personal level, history can also be seen as a mirror. Throughout history, how many women have lived a truly happy life? To place all one's affections on one person, only to have them unrequited, to keep all one's feelings hidden within, unable to express them freely, like a red thread of fate entirely dependent on the direction of another, constantly worrying and insecure. What meaning is there in such a life? If one seeks nothing and worries about nothing, then one's spirit will always be joyful. She seemed to have said something wrong, as His Majesty's face turned a frightening shade of green, his eyes flashing with an icy coldness. Amelia Mason nervously lowered her head in self-reproach. Was this the queen he had poured his heart into? In her heart, there was never a place for him. Had he not been good to her, allowing this woman to live a peaceful life within the palace walls? He had shielded her from so many storms, yet she willfully immersed herself in her own world, without a thought for him. "My queen, do I hold no value in your heart?" he asked, defeated. Amelia Mason, seeing a flicker of pain in His Majesty's eyes, stood up anxiously. She fearfully took his hands. "You are my His Majesty." "Only my His Majesty?" he pressed. She puzzled over this. What else could he be, if not His Majesty? Edward Windsor sighed. The palace needs to select new concubines. The ministers say the harem is too desolate and needs more people to liven the atmosphere. Edward Windsor sulked, his face darkening. She might not care about him, but plenty of others did. Amelia Mason felt a sharp pang in her heart, a flicker of pain crossing her face, but she quickly composed herself and said, "I understand. I will instruct the palace maids to prepare the chambers for the newcomers." His heart feeling as if it were cracking, Edward Windsor gave a bitter laugh. "I have been on the throne for 3 years. Due to my innate stubbornness and foolishness, I could only rely on diligence and dared not indulge in music or women. Now that the realm is peaceful, I should also enjoy the pleasures of being an emperor." "Oh," Amelia Mason responded with a cool smile. Remembering her duties as queen, she gently reminded him, "His Majesty, you should find some time to visit Clara Thompson and Sophia Bennet, and perhaps offer them some comfort." He released her hands, his brows furrowed. "I know. It's getting late. You should return." She curtsied and took her leave. On her way back, a misty rain fell, and rose petals littered the ground. Overcome with emotion by the poignant scene, her eyes welled up. Alone late that night, she found that writing, for the first time, failed to calm her mind. She asked Grace Mason to bring her the antique lyre and played a melancholic tune. That night, the clear, high notes of the lyre echoed through the palace, filling the air with a poignant sorrow. Tonight, His Majesty remained in the study, reviewing memorials until dawn. Why this countenance? Early morning, William Carter entered Celestial Hall, finding His Majesty at breakfast, a bowl of porridge stirred repeatedly, yet uneaten. A palace maid brought another chair for William Carter, but he refused with a smile, observing His Majesty's evidently heavy-hearted expression. "Brother William, could Princess Carter and Emily reside within the palace? He lacks a mother, and Princess Carter's maternal affection is all he possesses. Is the palace so cold? Hundreds of palace maids, thousands of eunuchs, yet they are mere ornaments, unable to warm his heart. At the ends of the earth, he remains solitary. I wish to show filial piety, treating the princess as my own mother. William Carter nodded understandingly. Royal brother, if you have worries, speak freely. We can share our thoughts over drinks. Edward Windsor, given an inch, wanted a mile. Your Majesty, grown princes cannot reside within the palace. This is protocol. Does your Majesty intend to break tradition? Recall that Prince Sebastian of Fairhaven, Sebastian Windsor, also moved out of the palace. Edward Windsor nodded. Since his second brother left the royal palace, rumors had circulated, slandering him. Out of brotherly affection, he hadn't pursued the matter, sending Sebastian Windsor away from the capital to distant Westport, granting him the title Prince Sebastian of Fairhaven, to live a peaceful life. How is he lately? It's said he's taken several more princesses, having them run naked and play games daily. The spectacle is considered quite unseemly. Edward Windsor sighed. Since that person's departure, as long as he harbored no ill intentions, even if his actions defied convention, he turned a blind eye. Your Majesty, to quell future troubles, you should produce a crown prince soon. William Carter solemnly reminded Edward Windsor. Royal brother, I had 3 brothers. Risking my life to let one go, the current situation isn't ideal. I've considered this matter due to my mother's unfortunate circumstances. I think I must have a child, with only one mother. Not conceived casually. Consider my mother, a palace maid in life, nameless in death. I don't want a child to experience my childhood. Married 3 years, I haven't dared let the imperial consorts conceive. I dream that if I cannot live like ordinary couples, hand in hand until old age, I must have someone who shares my thoughts and feelings, loving and supporting me. I want to have many children with her. William Carter smiled. Is the Empress not suitable? She was chosen by Edward Windsor himself, deeply admired since his youth. Edward Windsor's face darkened with displeasure. He angrily retorted, don't mention her. She's preparing to retreat to the mountains. He needn't concern himself with her. Ah, a lover's quarrel. William Carter chuckled. He'd long discerned the Empress's unusual temperament, a fire buried deep, waiting for the right person to ignite it. I intend to heed the official's advice and select suitable women from the court to enter the palace. Ah, Your Majesty, a word of caution, this matter requires careful consideration. Some regrets are irreversible. William Carter saw His Majesty's petulance, making foolish choices, but it was amusing to watch. He didn't wish to spoil the show. A harem full of consorts is not a blessing. Moreover, His Majesty's dream would never be fully realized. My mind is made up. William Carter shook his head. His Majesty was so resolute, he could only sit back and watch the show. Chapter 5, Prince Vincent Wilder's residence stood in the east of the capital. Within the mansion, carved pillars and multi-storied towers rose like mushrooms. The central hall boasted a crimson-painted roof, oil spread across the floor, golden-painted bronze doors, jade steps, intricately crafted lanterns, azure jade, and sparkling pearls. Treasures inlaid with jewels were everywhere. In the garden outside, numerous grotesque rockeries, rare plants, and a menagerie filled with exotic creatures could be seen. Prince Vincent Wilder enjoyed rising early. The first thing he did after leaving his bed was to visit the garden and the menagerie to observe the beasts. The servants had already prepared raw bird meat. He stood by the cages, tossing the meat while cursing, beasts. I feed you, I raise you, yet you don't even comfort me. I'm looked down upon, and you don't help me get revenge. Tell me, what's the use of keeping you? As he spoke, he kicked the cage doors twice. The servants, witnessing this, wanted to laugh but dared not, enduring it with all their might. This prince, seemingly fierce, was actually a fool, not even as bright. As a child, everything showed on his face, he dared to say and do anything. But as long as someone pleased him, he would grant any request. Princess Rose Windsor stood in the garden, her brow furrowed as she watched her sons rambling, her heart in turmoil. Since His Majesty allowed him to return home to recuperate, the mansion hadn't seen a day of peace, all the misfortune stemming from the relief funds. She knew her son was usually frivolous and wicked, a scoundrel, but even if he committed a grave offense, he was still her flesh and blood, the only person she could rely on in this world. She would do anything for him, as long as he was happy, she was happy. One day, he suddenly declared he wanted to work in the Treasury Department, no longer wanting to be an idle prince. This filled her with joy for a long time, thinking he had finally matured. Immediately, Princess Rose Windsor went to see His Majesty. After a moment of silent deliberation, His Majesty agreed. Who knew that as soon as he took office, he would have to deal with the Riverlands flood disaster? The court allocated relief funds, and he clearly embezzled over 1 million taels, yet not half a tael could be seen in the mansion. This was a grave crime punishable by the extermination of 9 generations, yet His Majesty simply overlooked it, merely stating to the court that Prince Vincent Wilder, worried about the flood situation and in poor health, was allowed to return home to recuperate. Recuperate, indeed, but it meant dismissal. Having grown up in the palace and witnessed countless storms, Princess Rose Windsor understood His Majesty's leniency. She was a sensible woman. When she married, His Majesty hadn't even been born. Although they shared the same father, they weren't close. Each king had his own court, she understood this principle well. While she could have pleaded with the previous emperor, she quickly and obediently brought her foolish son home. Alas, some people just didn't understand, committing a capital offense and remaining so nonchalant. She was truly worried. Treasury Department, the department responsible for tax management. After Vincent Wilder finished feeding the animals, his mood improved somewhat. Washing his hands, he turned and saw his mother, exclaiming happily, "Mother, why aren't you resting? It's still early." He was a brash man, but a filial son. Gently, he supported his mother as they strolled through the garden. Princess Rose Windsor looked tenderly at her son. "Cheng'er, mother has a question for you." "Yes, mother. Since you ask, I will tell the truth. Did you embezzle the relief funds? That matter?" Vincent Wilder looked around, avoiding his mother's probing gaze. He stammered, "Impossible. Mother, don't listen to the servants' gossip. Why are you asking me this so early in the morning?" Princess Rose Windsor said firmly, "No, you must explain this to me today. Otherwise, I fear there will come a day when I won't be able to save you. Mother, you underestimate me. In the future, I will be granted a title and bring glory to our ancestors. You just wait and enjoy the blessings." He raised his head, his face full of pride. Princess Rose Windsor looked at him in shock, asking suspiciously, "What will you do to bring glory to our ancestors?" Vincent Wilder embraced her. "Naturally, I have the support of an influential person. Mother, we must endure for now. When the time is right, we will begin our great undertaking. Then, I will command both wind and rain." Princess Rose Windsor was so frightened by these words that her vision darkened, and she nearly fainted. Fortunately, Vincent Wilder was beside her to support her. Trembling, she grasped his hand, tears welling in her eyes. "Cheng'er, tell mother, who is this influential person?" He wanted to continue deceiving her, but seeing his mother's pale, bloodless face, he stammered, "Prince Sebastian Windsor of Xiaoyao." Princess Rose Windsor's heart sank. Her voice was filled with anxiety as she asked, "He? Isn't he in faraway Westport?" "Yes, but he has many agents in the capital. Last year, they contacted me, asking me to find a way to seize the position in the Treasury Department and wait for the right moment to act. The current His Majesty is foolish, and his officials are disloyal. Many ministers are urging the second prince to return to the capital and ascend the throne. The second prince has promised to reward me with half the land south of the lower reaches of the Changjiang River, behind the mountains." Slap! Princess Rose Windsor gritted her teeth and swung her hand, striking Vincent Wilder. You fool. Have you ever considered what will happen if things fail? Your head will be separated from your body. Half the kingdom? Humph. Even brothers can be this ruthless, how could they treat an outsider well? You idiot, idiot, idiot. You've been used, and you still dare to be so smug. Vincent Wilder covered his face, his expression full of grievance. Mother, I admit I'm foolish and don't understand many things, but what about General Thompson and the others? Don't they know any better? You're saying General Thompson also knows about this? Yes, it seems Consort Clara Thompson is also involved. They always say if one plan fails, there's another. Since I've been confined to the manor, they haven't contacted me much. Oh my God, Princess Rose Windsor felt the world shake, and she quickly sank into an unprecedented fear. The autumn sky, the sun obscured by layers of clouds, momentarily appearing, then vanishing again, a gentle breeze, almost imperceptible, making it hard to feel distinctly. The weather perfectly suited one's mood, neither cool nor hot, the sun rising outside, yet some people reeked of unpleasant sweat, a restless summer making most people in the city fidgety. Anyone in the capital who enjoys drinking goes to the Drunken Muse Tavern, for it has good wine, delicious food, and beautiful singers. For tea, everyone must go to Virtue's Haven, the meaning of which is clear from its name, a beloved place for scholars and literati. Don't underestimate some of the tea drinkers with their plain appearances, for among them might be a future top scholar, Zhuang Yuan, top scorer in the imperial examination. Once someone becomes a top scholar, it's difficult to even meet them, so it's better to get close while they're still commoners, giving you a reason to ask for favors later. As long as you have some literary talent, the doors of Virtue's Haven are always open to you. Therefore, Virtue's Haven is increasingly crowded, packed with patrons. These talented individuals gather to recite poetry and sing ballads, a truly elegant scene. Soon, the regional examinations will be held in the capital, and Virtue's Haven has become a gathering place for candidates from many places. The most outstanding Riverwest candidate, Nicholas Gray, arrived in the capital a few days ago and has befriended several fellow candidates. Hearing of Virtue's Haven's reputation, they agreed to meet there, to experience it firsthand and see if it truly lives up to its name. As soon as the waiter saw them enter in their scholar attire, with the leader exuding an aura of talent and confident eyebrows, he knew they were of some importance. Smiling, he ushered them upstairs and served them the finest tea, freshly brewed. Nicholas Gray silently assessed the room, the wooden furnishings rustic yet refined, willow branches swaying outside the window, a gentle breeze, a scene pleasing to the heart. This tea-house appeared simple at first glance, but upon closer inspection, revealed intricate details, hinting at hidden delights. He thought to himself, this place is truly extraordinary. The number of guests wasn't large, perhaps because it was still early. Besides their group, there were a few other patrons chatting. At a table near the window sat two young lords and a young lady. One lord was gentle and refined, the other imposing and dignified, both exuding an admirable aura. The young lady looked quite young, with delicate features, gentle and quiet, her pure white attire radiating a natural elegance. Beside them stood several tall and strong servants. This was no ordinary young woman, and Nicholas Gray couldn't help but observe her a few times. The imposing young lord glared at him, and he quickly averted his gaze. Mr. Gray, you are Riverwest's top scholar. You will surely achieve the top rank in this regional examination. When that time comes, please remember this humble servant. A fellow candidate raised his teacup, a smile on his face as he looked at him. Nicholas Gray laughed conceitedly. I hear the current His Majesty values talent greatly. I wondered if it's true. If he truly is a beau loup, then perhaps I might encounter my own thousandly horse. Oh. Is Mr. Gray that confident? A Zhejiang scholar asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Why not give it a try? I'll offer a couplet. Let's see if Mr. Gray can match it. Xian Bagua, Kuan Bagua, 8864 Gua, every Gua defines Qian in Kuan. Asterisk, Qian, Kuan, a set of symbolic markings from ancient times, comprising 8 trigrams, Qian, Kuan, Kan, Li, Zhen, Zhen, Sun, Dui. 1 line represents heaven, 2 lines represent earth. Combining these creates 8 Bagua, each representing a specific element. Together, they form 64 Gua, symbolizing natural and supernatural phenomena, later used for divination. Asterisk as the couplet was presented, the scholars scratched their heads, discussing amongst themselves. Though only 18 characters, 7 were unmatchable, making it quite the challenge. Nicholas Gray smiled and replied in a clear voice, 9 cries, Fong 9 cries, 9 nines 81 cries, every cry harmonizes Luan and Fong. Asterisk, Luan calls 9 times, Fong calls 9 times, 9 times 9 is 81 calls, Luan and Fong call together. Asterisk, excellent. Excellent. The seated scholars nodded in approval, some from other tables coming over to observe. Only the 2 young gentlemen and the lady remained by the window, calmly sipping their tea. Another scholar, seated in the middle, excitedly declared, I'll offer one, every morning, 10th month, 10th day. It was a wordplay couplet, quite rare. The scholars tapped their feet smugly, each making their own guesses. Elder brother, for mouths, for men, Nicholas Gray chuckled, offering the second line. The scholars nodded in admiration, acknowledging the perfect match. For a while, each person offered a line, and Nicholas Gray matched them all flawlessly. No need to test me further. I'll offer one, let's see if you gentlemen can match it, Nicholas Gray said, furrowing his brow. Duan cultivates bamboo, bamboo splits finely, finely woven basket, basket holds Duan. The scholars exchanged glances, a sense of apprehension washing over them. It was a rare and difficult couplet, the first and last characters the same, the middle characters forming a cyclical pattern. The tea-house fell silent, a word or two occasionally uttered, only to be followed by shakes of the head and further contemplation. Wood makes a tree, tree sawed into planks, planks nailed to a boat, boat carries wood. The words came from the young lady by the window. Both the scholars and Nicholas Gray were stunned into silence. Nicholas Gray turned, stood, and bowed respectfully. Lady, you are truly brilliant. The lady offered a slight smile, not looking at him. The refined gentleman stood and invited him to join them. The waiter, obliging, moved a table closer to the window. The imposing man, seemingly displeased, quickly shielded the lady, preventing others from approaching. Nicholas Gray sat upright, filled with admiration for the lady. He quickly recited, in my youth, at 14 or 15, my ambition lay in poetry, mistaken for a pearl among pebbles, patiently enduring the mundane. Maintaining my loftiness, I survey the world from on high, pondering deeply. It means, immersing oneself in books and poetry enhances clarity of thought and equips one to overcome difficulties. She smiled serenely, her eyes clear, and slowly recited, missing my lord on an autumn night, I stroll and admire the bright moon. Pine needles fall on the silent mountain, a lonely soul finds no sleep. The multitude knows not the depth of autumn's allure, only the south wind whispers secrets as it departs eastward. Who hides such solitary pride? A single bloom unfurls, indifferent to the world's delay. Dew-kissed paths, how desolate the riverbank at dusk. Returning geese, can they share my longing for the palace? Say not there's no one in this world to converse with, who understands the language of the whispering fan. The first 2 lines, pine needles fall across the hills on an autumn night, the lonely soul humorously cannot sleep, implying that the autumn night is like missing a gentleman, reminiscing about leisurely days in the cool breeze, making it difficult for lonely souls to sleep. The last line, for those who love autumn, they know that autumn is like 2 hands gently touching and reluctantly parting. How exquisite! Who understands the language of the whispering fan? Nicholas Gray exclaimed joyfully. Though young, miss, your mind is a treasure trove of literature. I am truly impressed. The image of this beautiful young woman had, unknowingly, already entered his heart. Those around them nodded in agreement and praise. You deem yourself capable of recognizing a thousandly horse. You must possess some talent. Perhaps you desire an official position. How do you envision harmony between ruler and subject? A majestic man leaned forward, obscuring his view, and posed the question. Nicholas Gray pondered for a moment, then calmly replied, a monarch is like a dragon in the sky, and his subjects are like the clouds. The dragon's breath forms the clouds, which it uses to approach the moon, to command thunder and lightning, to perform wondrous transformations. The dragon and clouds become extraordinary, the clouds enhance the dragon's majesty. They support and depend on each other. The majestic man's face remained impassive, yet a hint of admiration flickered in his eyes. The young woman, however, simply smiled and sipped her tea, a few drops inadvertently spilling onto her wrist. The man swiftly reached out, taking her hand and wiping it dry with a cloth. A handsome young man observed all of this, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Nicholas Gray couldn't help but feel a pang of bewilderment. What was this man's relationship to her? Brother William, we've been out for a while. We should return, the majestic man said gently, helping the young woman to her feet. The handsome man nodded and clapped Nicholas Gray on the shoulder. Thousandly horse, pursue your ambitions freely. Nicholas Gray blushed. My words were presumptuous. Please don't take them seriously. The majestic man glanced at him. I do take them seriously. It's too late to retract them now. Then there must be a Bull, Nicholas Gray replied. Bull, a man from the Qin state during the spring and autumn period, skilled in judging horses. Today, it refers to someone adept at discovering, recommending, nurturing, and utilizing talent. Bull can refer to an individual or a group. Bull has been waiting for you, the handsome man said with a smile. Nicholas Gray longed to speak a few more words to the young woman, but the majestic man had already guided her into a palanquin. As the curtains closed, the beautiful figure vanished. The entourage departed Virtue's haven. Nicholas Gray stared blankly after them, still dazed long after they were gone. Thus, another soul in the world was afflicted with an unspoken longing. Your Majesty, what do you think of that scholar? Inside the palanquin, Edward Windsor watched Amelia Mason, who remained silent. Because all the scholars in this aroma examination were talented, he and William Carter had previously agreed to personally assess their knowledge. Neither of them were particularly skilled, so the examiner could only be his well-read queen. He knew the queen was multi-talented, but this was the first time he had seen her like this. The scholar's resolute gaze sparked a flicker of annoyance within him. Amelia Mason breathed softly, very capable, ambitious, and composed. His Majesty can trust him. You hold him in such high regard. Edward Windsor's voice held a tinge of jealousy. Me? Is it wrong for me to recommend him? The decision rests with His Majesty. His Majesty has just ascended the throne. The court is full of ministers. Will they truly work diligently for His Majesty? She was right. Those ministers, arrogant and self-important, old and cunning, wouldn't work wholeheartedly. He needed some new blood to help him develop and innovate the country. This aroma examination was a good opportunity, otherwise he wouldn't be so cautious. My queen, if you were a man, how exceptional would you be? Edward Windsor murmured. Amelia Mason smiled. If I were a man, I wouldn't want to be an official. I'd want to travel the world, drinking freely with friends every day. Ah, Edward Windsor shook his head helplessly. It was fortunate she was a woman, otherwise, who knew how many people would be in trouble. Now, she was tormenting him enough as it was. Your Majesty, what about you? What about me? If you were a princess, what would you be like? I'd kill you. Ah, someone's face had gone pale. Amelia Mason cheerfully covered her mouth, laughing. Seeing her suddenly reveal such a lovely expression, he was mesmerized. Chapter 6, Tonight, the moon is bright, my heart is troubled. Cold incense, smoke dissipates. Red waves on the tilted blanket. Waking up, too lazy to comb my hair. Leaving the mirror box dusty. Sunlight through the curtain. Most afraid of the pain of parting. So many things. Unspoken. Lately, my body has grown thin. Not from illness. Not from sorrow. Oh well. This time, we are also separated. 10,000 miles of Yanguan Pass. Can hardly hold back. Missing the one far away. Smoke rises from Qin Tower. Only the river before the tower reflects my longing. Day after day, I wait. From this day forward, another wave of sorrow. This is a poem by Li Qingzhao, the foremost female poet of the Song dynasty in China, about a wife longing for her husband who is far away. Your Majesty, Grace Mason approached her gently, holding a coat. Since afternoon, Amelia Mason had been standing by the railing, lost in contemplation of the surrounding scenery. A gentle voice broke the silence, "It's cold outside, Your Majesty. We should go inside." She didn't move, staring into the distance. From this floor, so far away, her gaze seemed blocked by the palace walls. Outside the palace, that world had nothing to do with her. Ever since she accompanied His Majesty out of the palace to observe the scholars, her heart felt as if it had been left outside, never to truly return. Her eyes were always drawn to the willow branches swaying gently in the wind at Virtue's haven, the azure sky and vast sea, filled with poetry in her chest, making it impossible for her to sleep peacefully as before. Since childhood, with a book in hand, she could stand alone, sit for half a day, but today, those books had no effect. She yearned to be like a bird, freely flying out of this suffocating royal palace. It was late autumn, but clearly different. The royal palace courtyard was filled with the vibrant colors of summer, flowers blooming in a riot of color. A gust of autumn wind rushed through, scattering leaves across the sky, rose petals covering the ground, autumn finally passing. The royal gardens, the king's study, places she used to frequent, but now rarely visited. The imperial examinations had finally concluded, and Nicholas Gray had indeed achieved the top rank. The day of the court examination was also the day His Majesty selected. Beauties for the palace. Lanterns hung high within the inner palace, music filled the air, and His Majesty and his officials drank merrily. As the queen, she couldn't leave on such an occasion. From beginning to end, she sat upright, maintaining the decorum of her position. The new top scholar was in the king's study, and the new beauty was in the palace chamber closest to Celestial Hall. His Majesty had arranged everything, someone to review memorials, someone to attend to him, so what else did she need to worry about? Your Majesty, Grace Mason observed her mistress's long silence and, feeling sympathy, draped a cloak over her. Grace Mason, do you think the daffodils at Mason Estate are in bloom? She suddenly turned, her eyes fixed on Grace Mason, awaiting a reply. Grace Mason, holding the railing, paused for a moment before quickly replying, "Daffodils, Your Majesty. It's October now. Last year at this time, my lady just started planting them. They usually bloom in winter, so it'll be a few more months." Mason Estate, shaded by flowers and plants throughout the seasons, in winter, besides a garden of plum blossoms emitting a gentle fragrance, there was also the lingering scent of yellow daffodils in the rooms. Grace Mason noticed the queen's furrowed brow, a look of unease. Was she homesick? Come to think of it, she had left Mason Estate 2 years ago. She, too, missed the quiet courtyard there. Yellow daffodils. Amelia Mason sighed in slight disappointment and walked into the room with Grace Mason. Your Majesty. Grace Mason helped her onto the bed, offering a hand warmer to her icy hands. Seeing the queen finish a cup of hot tea, a slight blush coloring her face, she softly said, Grace Mason, I'll go to the kitchen and get a bowl of elixir root. I heard from the palace maids that Clara Thompson has good news. What? Grace Mason exclaimed. Amelia Mason didn't respond. A new beauty entered the palace, and Clara Thompson had joyful news. This year, the palace was full of happy events. Your Majesty, Grace Mason said with a hint of anger, haven't you noticed something strange? A new beauty enters the palace, and Clara Thompson has joyful news. Aren't you clever? Think about it. How could her intelligence be used for this? What does it have to do with her intelligence? Amelia Mason continued to speak slowly, two good things. It's not strange. Grace Mason, get my clothes. I want to visit Clara Thompson. She still remembered this courtesy. Grace Mason disagreed with her mistress's words, muttering, Your Majesty, is there truly only books in your heart and nothing else? Amelia Mason smiled faintly. How could she speak of her aspirations? Clara Thompson has good news, a new favored beauty. Sophia Bennet, daughter of the eldest princess, her maternal family's power is daunting. Your Majesty, what about you? You don't even think for yourself, just like an ordinary official, reviewing memorials. But now Master Gray is in charge of that. Your Majesty, what will you do from now on? Grace Mason was 4 years older than Amelia Mason. In this inner palace, she often paid attention and heard quite a few gossips. Her young mistress, she could pay attention to things on her behalf. Amelia Mason didn't even wrinkle her brow, turning around to hug Grace Mason's waist tightly, as if the Empress whispering everything to her had nothing to do with her. Your Majesty. This emperor hadn't even hurriedly sent a eunuch over. Grace Mason's voice choked in her throat. There's always a way. Why think so much? If I don't review memorials, I can read books. The harem shouldn't be concerned with national affairs. It doesn't matter who His Majesty favors, as long as they don't bother me. Who His Majesty loved was His Majesty's business. What did it have to do with her? As for those powers, those backgrounds, what good were they? Her parents in this world were always happy and respected, having spent decades together, their love only increasing, not decreasing, completely different from those other officials whose sons got into trouble today, but tomorrow they were still in the mood to play around with their wives and concubines. What was better about her? They should envy her. Looking at Grace Mason's expectant face, her own expression turned cheerful. She leaned coquettishly against Grace Mason's chest, Sister Grace Mason, don't be angry. Amelia will take you to the royal gardens to play. Grace Mason laughed through her tears. Her mistress was starting to act up again. She really had no way to resist. I'm not angry, Your Majesty. Let's go congratulate Clara Thompson. The mistress and servant didn't want to continue talking, and went downstairs together, stopping to admire each room along the way. Arriving in front of a rock garden, Grace Mason suddenly noticed a shadowy figure lurking behind the rocks. Looking again, it was gone. She rubbed her eyes and smiled. That person thought that hiding behind the rocks, others wouldn't see them, not thinking that under the sunlight, their shadow was boldly printed on the ground. She whispered a few words in Amelia Mason's ear. Amelia Mason nodded, her eyes wide with curiosity. Grace Mason quietly circled behind the rock garden and suddenly saw a man in court attire leaning against the rocks. Her eyes widened, and she shouted, "Who are you, so bold as to sneak around in the royal gardens?" The person hadn't expected anyone behind him, startling him. Turning around, he saw a beautiful palace maid, and his heart relaxed a little. But facing her stern expression, he couldn't help but panic, quickly saying, I am Vincent Wilder, here to congratulate consort Clara Thompson." Grace Mason, unaware of Vincent Wilder's identity, turned to Amelia Mason. "Ah, Prince Vincent Wilder. Grace, don't be rude. Amelia Mason approached, observing him lower his head with a seemingly frightened expression. She felt a flicker of amusement. How could the Prince Vincent Wilder, infamous for his wickedness, resemble such a child? Hearing someone recognize his title, Vincent Wilder joyfully lifted his head. He saw a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, with wide eyes and a refined countenance. Was this the Queen? Impudent! You dare look directly at the Queen with such brazen eyes? Bow your head and pay your respects. Grace Mason, standing beside them, glared at him disapprovingly. Vincent Wilder, startled, hastily bowed. Your Highness, Vincent Wilder pays his respects to the Queen. Was this the Queen? She looked like a young girl. The aura of that court lady was even more imposing. He couldn't explain why, but when the court lady glared, his legs felt weak with fear. Rise, Prince Vincent Wilder, Amelia Mason said, suppressing a smile. I was just about to visit Consort Clara Thompson. Shall we go together? Your Highness, I have already visited Consort Clara Thompson, as per my mother's instructions. Princess Rose Windsor is also entering the palace. She and I both entered the palace. However, my mother went to meet His Majesty, and I was tasked with delivering congratulatory gifts to Thompson Hall. Amelia Mason felt a prickle of curiosity. Wouldn't it be more appropriate for Princess Rose Windsor to offer congratulations? Why send Prince Vincent Wilder, a male, which seemed somewhat improper? If you were delivering congratulations, why were you hiding, making others mistake you for an assassin? Grace Mason's pretty face creased in a frown as she sternly questioned him. No, I wasn't hiding. Vincent Wilder waved his hands frantically. I merely lost my way and was a bit frightened. A guilty conscience is like a bird startled by the rustling of leaves. Ah! Vincent Wilder wiped the sweat from his brow with his sleeve. My words are entirely truthful. If I were lying, may lightning strike me down. The two women exchanged glances and burst into laughter. So, the legendary Prince Vincent Wilder was a paper tiger. Experiencing the unfamiliar feeling of being intimidated, unlike his usual arrogant demeanor stemming from the crown princess's excessive pampering, he wasn't quite as formidable as rumored. Amelia Mason, composing herself, assessed him with a gentle voice. Prince Vincent Wilder, aren't you waiting for Princess Jade to return to the manor with you? No, my mother said she wished to stay longer and discuss household matters with His Majesty. She told me to return to the manor first. I recall there used to be an exit from the northeast side of the royal gardens, but I couldn't find it today. That's the exit used by the eunuchs and servant maids. Why would you use that exit? It's closer. Closer to where? Clara Thompson's palace, Vincent Wilder mumbled, looking down. Ah, Amelia Mason understood. She assumed he wanted to take a shortcut back to the manor. Best not to overthink it. Let's go. I happen to be passing by there. I can accompany you part of the way. Vincent Wilder nodded repeatedly. The Queen was so kind, beautiful, and gentle, unlike that court lady who, despite her beauty, was too fierce. It was the first time he had been so intimidated by someone. Amelia Mason led the way, followed by Grace Mason, with Vincent Wilder trailing behind Grace. Though she didn't turn to glare at him, he felt a nervous tension, unsure of the proper distance to maintain. Finally reaching Sentinel Tower's entrance, his unease prompted a hasty farewell, almost a hurried escape. This entrance was actually quite close to Clara Thompson's quarters, even closer than the main gate. While everyone else entered through the main gate, Prince Vincent Wilder chose this side entrance. Amelia Mason shook her head, puzzled by his intentions. Clara Thompson lounged on her silken bed, languidly turning to listen to the physician. Since news of her pregnancy broke, the inner palace had been in a near uproar. Court officials, flocked to offer congratulations. The head chef delivered daily tonics, eunuchs and palace maids presented a constant stream of gifts, the physician checked on her multiple times a day, and even Sophia Bennet and the newer concubines arrived early each morning with cheerful greetings. Overnight, her status had skyrocketed, all thanks to the child in her womb. Clara Thompson gently caressed her belly, her face brimming with smug satisfaction. "Your ladyship, the Empress has arrived," a young palace maid announced, rushing in. Clara Thompson murmured an acknowledgement, unable to bring herself to rise. Beside her, the physician hastily stood and bowed deeply to the Empress. Amelia Mason returned the gesture with a gentle smile. "Your Majesty," Clara Thompson drawled, "the physician has advised against excessive movement due to the early stage of my pregnancy. Therefore, I cannot rise to greet you." Amelia Mason settled gracefully on the edge of the bed. "There's no need for formalities. Your health is paramount. I've come today to offer my congratulations." "Oh, thank you, Your Majesty. You are too kind. Being so young, you wouldn't understand the discomforts of pregnancy. I've been unable to eat or sleep properly and have lost so much weight." Clara Thompson pouted dramatically, her expression a captivating blend of coquettishness and slyness. Amelia Mason nodded, turning to address the physician. "During this time, I must rely on the imperial physician's utmost care." The physician bowed respectfully. "It is our duty, Your Majesty. Rest assured, Clara Thompson's condition will improve after the first 3 months." "Very well." Amelia Mason turned back to Clara Thompson. "Your ladyship, if you require anything, please inform the head steward directly. If that is inconvenient, you may send a palace maid to relay your request to me." Clara Thompson blushed delicately. "Thank you, Your Majesty." She had never harbored any animosity towards the Empress. Much younger than herself, Amelia Mason, despite her position, always treated them with respect, showing no resentment towards her or Sophia Bennet's favor with His Majesty. She knew the Empress preferred her books and rarely involved herself in court affairs. Aside from being a scholarly delight for His Majesty, she lacked the allure and influence that she and Sophia Bennet possessed. Perhaps it was her youth, her innocence of such matters. Her gaze subtly assessed Amelia Mason. The young Empress's delicate face, flushed with a youthful glow, was captivating. Her red lips, her finely arched, ink-black brows, she was shedding her childish innocence, blossoming into a captivating young woman. Next year, she would fully bloom. How breathtaking would she become then? A pang of envy pricked Clara Thompson. Later, when Clara Thompson gives birth to the dragon's son, the inner palace will certainly be very lively, His Majesty will be very happy. Amelia Mason said sincerely. "Yes, yes." Clara Thompson laughed unnaturally, stammering in reply. Everyone visited her during her pregnancy, but His Majesty hadn't shown up yet, making her a little worried. Grace Mason stood silently watching Clara Thompson's arrogant demeanor, her heart filled with anger. What's so special about having a child? Once the Empress grows up a little more, after consummating the marriage with His Majesty, she will definitely give birth to a bunch of princes and princesses, and then we'll see how arrogant you can be. Outside the palace, there was a sudden commotion. His Majesty rushed in, his expression unchanging as he looked at Amelia Mason, his whole being exuding an aura of suppressed anxiety. Clara Thompson stood up with a charming smile and ran to lean on His Majesty. "His Majesty, I've been waiting for you." His Majesty calmly pushed her away, saying, "Your body is more important, you shouldn't run around like that." Even as he spoke these words, his gaze remained fixed. Amelia Mason stood up, puzzled. "His Majesty." "Empress, how long have you been here?" "I just arrived." "Is there something wrong? Aren't you reviewing memorials today? Aren't you in the king's study?" Amelia Mason's mind raced, bewildered by his questions. Since when did he turn her into a tutor? Wasn't Nicholas Gray in the king's study? Couldn't he see where they were? His Majesty looked at her dazed expression and said coldly, "If you haven't finished, come with me. Say goodbye to Clara Thompson." With that, he took her hand. Amelia Mason had no choice but to take his hand, giving Clara Thompson a helpless smile. Before she could say goodbye, His Majesty pulled her out of the palace. Like a strong gust of wind, the inner palace returned to its original quietness, as if what had just happened hadn't occurred at all. Clara Thompson stood there dumbfounded, mouth agape. What just happened? In the king's study, paper, brushes, and ink were placed within His Majesty's easy reach. Memorials were spread across the table, indicating he had just been in the room. Nicholas Gray was not there. Her hand still in his, Amelia Mason hadn't yet regained her composure, only staring intently at His Majesty. The cold expression on his face gradually disappeared. After a long while, he tightened his grip on her hand and whispered, "Promise me, from now on, you will not go to Thompson Hall again." "But she's pregnant, according to the rules, I have to visit her," Amelia Mason explained. "One visit is enough. From now on, you must never go near that place again." She was taken aback for a moment, then nodded slightly. A king's word was law. She would obey, though she hadn't wanted to go there in the first place. "His Majesty," she said softly, lowering her head, "I have a request." His Majesty raised an eyebrow. "Ah, it seems this is the first time you've used the words, request. Tell me, what matter is so important to my Empress?" Amelia Mason blushed slightly, her eyes clear as water. "It's been 2 years since I married, and I should visit my parents." As for her parents, Grand Preceptor Mason wasn't particularly old, but he was nearing his twilight years. He had never wanted to serve in the court, having made it clear he wished to stay away from worldly affairs and let the Empress be a good person. He knew the truth and didn't want to expose it, yet she spoke of wanting to visit her parents. Winter is approaching, and there are many ceremonies to be performed in the inner palace. It's not a good time to leave the palace. He trembled, fear gripping him despite his attempts to hide it. "It won't be long, just 2 or 3 months." Amelia Mason tried to explain. 2 or 3 months, not long. That means forever not returning to the palace. No, this doesn't align with palace rules. His Majesty refused to negotiate, a flat-out rejection. Amelia Mason disappointedly lowered her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears of frustration. "Do you miss Mason Estate that much?" Seeing her like this, his heart softened, and he asked gently. He, too, missed that small courtyard. "Yes," she choked out, nodding. "You can only return for 10 days. No need to go back as the queen. Leave the palace discreetly. 10 days later, I'll send eunuch Lawrence Park to fetch you. You must return." Amelia Mason joyfully raised her head and excitedly threw herself into Edward Windsor's arms. "Thank you, Your Majesty, I will definitely return." It was rare for the Queen to initiate a hug. Her soft voice brushed against his neck as she held him tightly. His heart felt like waves rising and falling. "But there's one condition. You must tell me everything about your time outside the palace each day after you return." All right. Amelia Mason happily nodded immediately. "I'll go pack my luggage. Today counts as 1 day." He was indeed meticulous. Amelia Mason wanted to protest but immediately nodded. "All right, I'll listen to Your Majesty." "Take care, Your Majesty. See you in 10 days. With that, she lifted her skirt and happily ran out of the king's study, completely forgetting her queenly decorum. Edward Windsor smiled, watching her small figure disappear. His queen never asked for much, a little attention was enough to satisfy her. With a wife like this, what more could a husband ask for? Chapter 7, When the King is in Trouble, One Cannot Ignore, Part 1, Lord Grey, from now on, regarding work in the King's study, please pay more attention to my memorials. Certainly. Lord Grey, when you're free, please come to my house for a cup of tea. I've heard that Lord Grey's calligraphy is exquisite. Coincidentally, next month is my birthday celebration. Could I invite Lord Grey to write a couple of characters for me? Lord Grey is so young and talented. I wonder if you're married yet. After the court session, Nicholas Grey was quickly surrounded by the ministers waiting outside Celestial Hall. They chattered and pestered him with questions, making his face stiff, but he forced a smile once more. Yet, he still couldn't escape. Looking at the sky, it was almost noon, and he couldn't help but feel a little irritated. Quite a gathering of ministers today. William Carter, emerging from the Hall of Rising Sun, witnessed Nicholas Grey being bombarded with questions. The corner of his mouth curled into a slight smile as he casually remarked. Everyone turned around and, seeing Prince Carter, quickly rushed to greet him. I was just looking for top scholar Grey to inquire about something, and what a coincidence, I've run into you. Lord Grey, if you're not busy, could we talk while we walk? William Carter pretended not to notice the sycophantic minister's smiles falter as he pulled Nicholas Grey along, strolling towards the palace exit. The ministers looked at each other, their plans to curry favor with the top scholar seemed thwarted today. Nicholas Grey wiped his sweat-drenched forehead with his sleeve. As he walked, feeling immense gratitude towards William Carter. He observed William Carter closely. The prince was elegant and amiable, yet also awe-inspiring. The court officials seemed to hold him in considerable respect. Seeing him the same age as himself, yet commanding such authority, truly inspired admiration. Your Highness, if it weren't for your timely intervention, I wouldn't know when I would have been able to escape. William Carter turned his head, glancing at him with a faint smile. These people are like flies, swarming as soon as they catch a whiff of something appealing. You needn't pay them any mind. Those serving in court should be dedicated and impartial, not forming cliques. You're not one of them, so it's understandable that you find it difficult to adapt. Nicholas Grey nodded repeatedly. Your Highness speaks truly. I toiled over my studies for 10 years, not seeking fleeting fame or fortune, but only wishing to leave my mark on history. A noble aspiration. Are you living alone in the capital? You're welcome to visit Carter Manor sometime. I have 2 friends, one the wealthiest man in the capital, Chi Dai-Fi, and the other the cold-faced Chancellor Adrian Blake's son. Both are remarkably accomplished and enjoy the company of exceptional individuals. I'm sure you'd find them agreeable. Nicholas Grey felt a surge of delight upon hearing this. If heroes indeed flocked together, and Prince Carter possessed such exceptional charisma and prowess, then his friends must also be extraordinary. Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness. With your introduction, I shall certainly make their acquaintance. If we are to be friends, there's no need for such formality. I'm the eldest of the 3, they call me brother, and you may do the same, Nicholas. William Carter clapped Nicholas Grey on the shoulder, speaking sincerely. Warmth filled Nicholas Grey's heart. He looked at William Carter respectfully and nodded slightly. I must escort a friend to a tea house 10 miles from here today, otherwise, this would be an excellent opportunity. No rush. Are the people you mentioned the scholars who failed the imperial examination? Indeed, they are the same group you encountered at Virtue's Haven, Brother Carter. Mentioning Virtue's Haven brought a pang of sorrow to Nicholas Grey's heart. He had always prided himself on being the most talented scholar in the land, never imagining he would be so thoroughly outshone by a woman. Her beautiful image had haunted him ever since. He thought that if he could earn a place on the Golden List, he would search the entire capital, request an audience with her family, and share wine and poetry with her. Yet, during the celebratory banquet at Celestial Hall, he felt no joy at seeing her again, only forcing a smile and enduring the event. The beautiful figure sat beside the Emperor, the distance between them as vast as the Milky Way. At their first meeting, she had been vibrant and intelligent, but on that day, she resembled a wooden statue, sitting stiffly according to protocol. That was the day His Majesty took another concubine, and she was expected to offer congratulations. A profound unease gnawed at Nicholas Gray, a mixture of resentment and helplessness. His heart burned throughout the day. "Ah, I see. Well then, you should go. Don't keep your friends waiting," William Carter urged him. Nicholas Gray nodded, swallowing his sorrow, and bowed his farewell. William Carter smiled, watching Nicholas Gray's retreating figure. An aura of nobility emanated from him, a man of righteousness, a rare encounter indeed. His presence was a blessing to the court, but why did a shadow of sorrow linger on his thick eyebrows? Could it be that a name on the golden list and His Majesty's favor couldn't dispel the melancholy in his heart? How peculiar. William Carter shook his head, glancing at the palace guards. He, too, should return to his estate. Autumn winds blew, trees swayed, and the river ran dry. In the outskirts, 10 miles from the capital, stood a tea-house beside nearly dried-up streams that flowed through a rocky terrain, flanked by 2 untended chrysanthemum bushes. On the main road, a pine tree clung to a few green needles, seemingly drained of life. A gust of wind rustled through, and a layer of pine needles fell to the ground. Autumn winds blow, sorrows assail, sorrow upon departure, sorrow upon return. Who among us is without care? It turns my hair white. The land is filled with whistling winds, trees sway gently. Days away from home drag on. My thoughts are unspeakable, carriage wheels turn in the courtyard. Amelia Mason wrapped her shawl tighter, observing people 10 miles ahead bidding farewell over drinks, and softly recited the poem. My dear child, are you, too, viewing autumn with the melancholic eyes of the ancients? Grand Preceptor Mason, in elegant robes, stood beside his wife, supporting her as he gazed at the pensive face of the woman before him. Father, I am still young and haven't experienced the world's sorrows. I cannot feel much about withering plants. But at this moment, witnessing the desolate autumn scene and the parting of travelers, I can't help but feel a touch of emotion. Alas, it's late autumn. You insisted on visiting this tea-house 10 miles from the capital, only to add to your worries. Madame Mason's loving gaze held a hint of concern for her daughter. After finally returning home for a few days, she refused to stay, determined to go for a stroll, claiming even a breath of fresh air would do her good. Her delicate eyelashes fluttered as she leaned against her mother's chest, saying affectionately, "Mother, you don't understand. The autumn scenery in these outskirts is the true autumn, unlike the eternal spring within the inner palace. Living there for so long, I sometimes wouldn't even know the seasons had changed, like a fool, relying on Grace Mason for reminders. Look, this strong wind, much like that day with the cold drizzle, has caused the flowers to wither and the leaves to fall. It's all the natural order. I feel a sense of longing, yet a strange peace within my heart." Grand Preceptor Mason and his wife exchanged glances, shaking their heads silently. Amelia Mason hugged Madame Mason affectionately, asking with a smile, "Mother, are you feeling sad too? I can't bear to be away from you, just like before." Madame Mason trailed off, her eyes welling up as 2 tears streamed down her cheeks. Grand Preceptor Mason, too moved to look, turned away, his robes fluttering in the wind. "Mother, while there were indeed many rules in the palace, His Majesty never demanded much of me, always protecting me. Remember, as soon as I mentioned missing home, he allowed me to return, didn't he?" Amelia Mason gently wiped the tears from her mother's cheeks, offering soft comfort. Lady Mason's tears flowed uncontrollably, her heart a sea of uncertainty. How could a gentle soul like hers, innocent as a babe, navigate the treacherous currents of the inner court, teeming with concubines and beauties of all ranks? She couldn't fathom why His Majesty, upon first glance at Amelia, had declared her queen. From the moment the decree arrived, she envisioned a future nightmare, weeping nightly while cradling her infant, only to be comforted by Amelia herself. "Mother, you mustn't cry anymore. Look at those departing people, they've already turned back. If they see you like this when they pass by, won't it be embarrassing?" Amelia Mason said, gently shaking her mother's hand. Lady Mason's tears turned to laughter as she playfully swatted Amelia's hand and wiped the remaining moisture from her eyes. On the main road, several figures on horseback approached, their long robes billowing in the wind, their bearing suggesting scholarly refinement. Steward Mason, with his wife and daughter, retreated a few steps to the roadside, wary of startling the horses. The riders showed no intention of hastening their pace, content to let their mounts stroll leisurely. As Amelia Mason casually glanced up, one of the riders turned, his eyes widening upon seeing her. He quickly dismounted and moved to kneel, but she swiftly raised a finger to her lips, silencing him. He nodded, his face a mixture of surprise and excitement. Amelia? Steward Mason turned to his daughter, his face etched with puzzlement. Who is this man who dismounted so hastily upon seeing you? Father, this is Master Gray.